The Albatross by Scott Lauder.
The three men were sitting around a table in the ship's galley. Only 10 minutes had passed since the visit from the harbor police, but the captain of the Albatross had already forgotten the lieutenant's name. When Carlos asked him about what had happened, the captain shrugged. "The cop asked a few questions. Nothing to worry about," he said. "So what happens now?" asked Carlos. "Hopper," said the captain, "wants me to meet him later in town. The deal is arranged for 4 a.m. We bring the birds, he brings the cash." Hopper was the man who bought the animals that they smuggled, and he only wanted to deal with the captain. That made Carlos mad. Why should the captain get $30,000? Was his job twice as dangerous? Was he twice as smart? There must be some way to make Hopper trust me, thought Carlos. I need to get Hopper's number or... Slowly, another plan began to form in his head. Andre finished eating his apple and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "What about the police?" he asked, moving his eyes from the captain's face to Carlos's. "What about them?" asked the captain. "Are they coming back?" "Perhaps. I showed them the hold and our passports, but they'll want to check all of our stories about Levi," replied the captain, getting to his feet. "Why are you going to see Hopper by yourself?" asked Carlos suddenly. For a moment, the captain was too surprised to say anything, and a silence fell. Then he let out a deep breath and smiled coldly. "It's very simple. Hopper is a very nervous man, and you, my friend, make him even more nervous." Although it was late afternoon, the sun was still shining brightly and the air was hot. Molly, however, was walking beneath the trees. She was enjoying the coolness of the shade, the sharp smell of pine trees, and the sight of Pip chasing birds. She was on the narrow path that led around the hills and into Haven. Earlier, Aunt Ellie had noticed that they were running out of dog food. "I'll go," Molly had said immediately. "I need the walk." Below the tallest tree in the woods, she looked at her watch. It was nearly 4:30. "I hope the pet store is open," she thought. "After all, it is Memorial Day. If it's shut, I'll go to Marty's," Molly thought. "I can get some cans of meat in there at least." Marty's was the local drugstore, and it never closed. Pip was now at her side, and a few moments later, they both stepped out of the woods and onto Haven's Main Street. "Don't worry," she said to Pip. "We're nearly there." She reached out to put a leash on Pip. He, however, turned his head sharply and went running after 2 seagulls on a nearby low wall. They watched him come noisily toward them. Then, stretching their long wings, they rose lazily above the wall and rooftops. Pip and Molly watched them fly toward the woods, when suddenly they changed their course and dived away, heading instead toward the open ocean. Puzzled, Molly looked to see why. Out of the sun, a dark shape came. She narrowed her eyes. It was a falcon, perhaps the same one from the beach. Flying fast and low, it passed overhead. It then landed on the top of a warehouse beside a ship that was in the dock. Pip barked. "Let's get you some food," she said. A few moments later, they arrived outside the pet store. Molly tied Pip to the railing and went inside. In a building across the road from the pet store, Sergeant Bergson moved back from the curtains and turned to Lieutenant Mundy. "Sir, you need to take a look at this." "What is it?" Lieutenant Mundy asked, coming to the window. He took the binoculars, and for a moment he stopped breathing. "What should we do, sir?" "Get SWAT here, now!" roared Dan Mundy. Inside the store, the usual smell of straw and small animals greeted Molly, but there was no one behind the counter. She took 2 cans of dog food from the shelf. Should I just leave the money next to the cash register? She wondered. Then she heard voices. They were coming from the back of the store. With the can still in her hand, she stepped behind the counter. A door to another room was open slightly. "Everything's fine," said a man's voice from behind the door. "We had a little problem, but everything's fine." "A problem?" asked the other person. Molly recognized the voice. It was Mr. Hopper's, the pet store owner. "We had to bring him back to the ship. We'll dump his body again once we get into deeper water. I don't like it. I just don't like it. Murder wasn't part of the deal," replied Mr. Hopper. "Shut up. You don't need to like it. I'll worry about Levi. You worry about paying me the $80,000. Molly could hardly breathe. She had to get out of here. She had to tell her father. She had to explain what she had heard. She turned around. A pair of green eyes stared straight at her. "Little girls with big ears," said the man who stood in front of her, "might hear something they shouldn't." For a second, Molly thought about rushing past this man, but his heavy body filled the space between her and the front door completely. She took a step back. The man didn't move or say a word, but Molly was scared. It was his eyes, his green, narrow eyes. They were as hard and as dead as steel. Molly felt her heart begin to beat faster. Through the window, she could see Pip outside by the railing. He was standing and watching the man's every move. His teeth were bared, and his ears were flat against his head. "I was just buying some dog food for my dog," said Molly, trying to keep her breathing normal, trying to sound brave. She held up the 2 cans. The man said nothing, but his green eyes continued to stare. "Do something!" shouted some part of Molly's brain. She cast her eyes around. Behind her, at the end of a short corridor, she saw there was another door. An exit? A storeroom? The man with the green eyes seemed to read her thoughts. Before Molly could move, his arm was up against the wall, blocking her way. "Relax," he said, breathing into her face. "Who's there?" called a voice. Molly turned as the half-open door swung sharply open. A heavy man in black pants and a black jacket stepped forward, followed by a pale-faced Mr. Hopper. "What are you doing here?" shouted the man in the black uniform. The man with green eyes smiled. "Following you," he said calmly. "What's going on?" asked Mr. Hopper. Molly and he were now both behind the counter. "Who's he? And what's she doing here?" he asked, jerking a thumb at Molly. The 2 men ignored him. Instead, they stood eye to eye, a few feet apart. From behind the counter, Molly had a good view of Pip. He was barking loudly, pulling at his leash, and trying to get his head out of his collar. "His name's Carlos," said the man in the black uniform, "and he was just leaving." Carlos smiled again. "I don't think so," he said. "The captain and I have something to talk about." "There's nothing we need to talk about," replied the captain. "You're wrong," Carlos said calmly. "You see, I want you to explain the difference between $60,000 and $80,000. "What's he talking about?" asked Hopper, leaning across the counter toward the two men. Outside, Molly saw that Pip was no longer struggling to get free. Instead, he was standing quietly, his tail moving from side to side happily. "That's strange," she thought. "He's talking nonsense," said the captain. Carlos's face changed. "I always knew you were a liar," he said. Suddenly, Carlos moved toward the captain. He had a knife in his hand. Just in time, the captain raised his arm and stopped Carlos's knife from plunging into his chest. The captain grabbed Carlos's wrist, and the two men began fighting, crashing into shelves and smashing into cages. Out of the corner of her eye, Molly saw a gray uniform outside the store. Then everything happened at once. Carlos pushed the knife toward the captain's neck. Hopper screamed. The door at the back of the store exploded. Shouts filled the air. Hopper threw his hands up. The police threw the men to the ground. Molly jumped across the counter and into her father's arms. In an instant, it was over. Molly was safely outside the store with a blanket around her shoulders, watching while Carlos, the captain, and Hopper were handcuffed and taken to 3 separate police cars. Her father put his arms around her and gave her a huge hug. "I'm fine, Dad. Honestly, I am," she said, while at the same time trying to stop Pip from jumping up and licking her face. But her father noticed her hand was shaking, a typical symptom of shock. "Let someone check you, okay? Just for me. It'll take 2 minutes, I promise." Molly was too tired to argue. "Okay," she said, handing Pip's leash to her father. "You win." Her father smiled. They were almost at the steps of the ambulance when she glanced over her shoulder. The police cars that were carrying Carlos, Hopper, and the captain were moving slowly up Main Street. But the crowd wasn't watching them. Instead, everyone was looking at something else, something in the sky. She stopped and looked up too. The sky was full of falcons. They all seemed to be coming from one ship in the harbor, and they were moving in all directions at once.